Welcome to Inside the Corner Office, a podcast where you will be taken behind the scenes of the daily life of a CEO. I'm Thomas Buberl, CEO of AXA. In each episode of this podcast, we will delve into a specific aspect of this role. You will see that making decisions from an office is definitely not what this job is all about. For every topic, we'll be joined by a leader of a major organization. I hope you will enjoy these discussions. Tune in and take a seat at the table. We are inside the corner office. Today, I'm joined by Marcelo Claure, a global investor and operator working at the intersection of technology, capital, and transformation. He's a partner and co-chair at Brightstar Capital Partners, a multi-billion-dollar investment firm focused on applying AI to transform businesses. He's also the CEO of Claure Group, his private investment firm, deploying proprietary capital across multiple sectors. Marcelo also holds leadership roles at Shein, Bicycle Capital, and the Harvard AI Institute. He previously led SoftBank Group International and played a key role in the Sprint T-Mobile merger that reshaped the telecom industry. Today, through activities spanning technology, capital, and sport, he continues to navigate environments where adaptation, judgment, and long-term vision remains essential. Welcome, Marcelo.
Thank you. Good to see you, Thomas.
Good to see you. Thanks for being here. Do you remember the first time we met?
I actually do.
Tell me.
I met you through a common friend,
Yes.
Karim,
Exactly.
who's one of the best AI professors in Harvard. I asked him, who are the most interesting people I should meet? And your name came up, and then we got into a phone call. I actually do remember.
I hope you weren't disappointed.
No. I started throwing my ideas of what I'm doing now with you back then.
Yes.
And you thought it was a good idea, so here we are.
Very good. You've got a very interesting life. You started as an employee. You then became entrepreneur. You're now investor. Tell me a little bit how you designed your life, if you even designed it.
Yeah, you don't. You don't design your life. I think life is a multitude of opportunities, and it's whether you decide to take them or not. And, my first real job was a fascinating job. It was the day after I graduated university. I was going back to my home country in Bolivia, and I met somebody in the plane who was the president of the Bolivian Soccer Federation. He invited me to be the vice president, and I had a job before I landed. My parents were very disappointed that I was entering the world of football at my early age. And, probably the biggest story of my life was that was the only time in the history of Bolivia that Bolivia went to the World Cup. So we had a big dream, we had a plan, and against all odds, Bolivia made it to the World Cup in 1994. And that was probably the single moment that reshaped my life. After that, I became an entrepreneur. I bought one little shop, a mobile phone shop in Boston. I figured it was going to take too long to open many shops, so I invented a concept that people could call you and we will deliver a phone in less than 30 minutes at the beginning of what I call the phone revolution, because back then there were not a lot of phones. So that was my first real job. I grew that to be the largest wireless retailer in all of the Northeast in the U.S. I sold it. That's the beauty of the United States. I call it the American dream. You have a business, you make it grow for a year, and then you sell it for a few $1 million. That led me to my next business, which is it was started as a distribution company. It's a company called Brightstar back then, and the Brightstar name had been following me. I started from zero, selling phones from the back of my car. Brightstar grew to be the world's largest distribution company with presence in 70 countries, and at one point in time, actually selling one or touching one out of our 6 mobile phones all over the world. So that was my first real business. And there's special joy when you can say that you're number one in the world. So that was my first business called Brightstar.
And so going back to the story in the plane, why did this guy pick you and offer you a job? What did he see in you that made him make that decision on the flight?
So I was very young. I was 22 years old. And I guess, we hit it off. He was a big dreamer, right? For Bolivia to win the World Cup, or for Bolivia to make it to the World Cup, it's like a second division team in France to win the Champions League. It's not supposed to happen because we play Brazil, we play Argentina. And by the time we landed, he says, you have something in you that if we partner, his big dream was say, Bolivia will win the World Cup. Well, I said, first, we got to make it to the World Cup. Yeah. And there are dreamers like that actually have no limitations. And that was probably, at that moment, reshaped my life forever. Not only did we make it to the World Cup, but through fortune of life, we got to open the World Cup. We were the first game, June 27, 1994, in the World Cup in the United States. So that was a life-changing moment for me, because I think most of us limit our ambition to the size of our dreams. And that helped me. When I started Brightstar, right, I remember from day one when I started that company, I said, I'm going to be number one in the world. Everybody laughed at me. They say distribution is a working capital business. You have no money. And, we grew that business. That business evolved from being a distribution company. It became the leading supply chain company in the wireless world. Pretty much most telcos in the world outsource their supply chain. I bought an insurance company for people who lost their phones or damaged their phone. That was my first entry into insurance. I had the chance of convincing Steve Jobs of selling me used Apple phones so I could use them to pay down claims and not give people new phones, because when you pay people with new phones, then they mysteriously lose their phones and they mysteriously damage their phones. Yeah. We set up a bank so we could finance phones for people. And then I always tell people that all of us are always given an opportunity. Somebody take it and somebody doesn't, but all of us in our entire life. And my next big break came, I was in Barcelona at our big trade show. It's called the GSMA, or the Mobile World Congress in Barcelona. And one of my customers canceled the meeting, so I went outside to smoke a cigarette. Back then it was okay to smoke a cigarette. And I sat next to a Japanese person, and we started telling each other stories. And by the time I told him my story, he said, oh my God, you have to meet this guy called Masa, my boss. I had no idea who Masa was. I went back to my hotel, I Googled Masa, and I was very impressed. So then I went and visited Masa in Japan, and that was the next journey of my life.
Going back, to always have a dream. I think that's important, and to think big and not too small. How do you do that, and how do you also reinvent yourself? Because, you have plenty of stories of dreams. Most people that I meet have had one dream, have realized it, but then have difficulties to reinvent themselves with another dream. What is your secret?
I think we always want to take on new challenges. And I think the Masa challenge, it's probably one of the craziest stories in corporate America. I meet Masa, I tell Masa what I do. Yeah. And he immediately falls in love with the concept of buyback and trading of mobile phones. He says, do you mean to tell me that you can buy my used iPhone, you can pay me, and that way I can give that money to my customers? When I did that for AT&T paid the money to his customers. Masa is very smart. Masa says, I grab the money and I give it back to my customers in 24 months. And Masa asked me, how long did it take you to do it for Verizon? I told him it took us 1 year. And Masa says, can you do it in 3 days? I called my engineers. They put him in a plane. We translated the software. And in 3 days later, we were operating in 4,000 stores in Japan. And he was very, I would say, impressed by our execution capabilities, our ability to say no. Then Masa did the largest investment, and I would say probably the worst investment ever, from a Japanese company. He bought a telecommunications company called Sprint. Masa called me, he invited me to be on the board, which to me was incredible. I say, from a distributor to being in a board of a large, a company with a lot of history in the United States. Everybody knows Sprint. Sprint is a very well-known brand. And he invited me to be in the board. And I went to the board. I went to my first board meeting. I looked at the financial statements, and Sprint was losing $4 billion a year. And it was really strange because they were losing $4 billion a year, and everybody was happy. Everybody was drinking French wine. They picked me up in a private plane. I was like, I had never flown a private plane before. And everybody seemed happy losing $4 billion. And I remember asking the first question. I said, God, we had a really bad year. I said, how was last year? They said, we lost $5 billion. And the year before, $4 billion. And the year before. So it was a company that had accumulated losses for the last 10 years of about $40 billion. And I just couldn't believe companies like that existed. So then Masa called me the following morning. And he said, what do you think? I said, this is terrible. I said, I have never seen so much irresponsibility. I was an entrepreneur at that point in time. And then he stayed quiet. The following day, he says, I have an idea. I said, what? he says, why don't you come run Sprint? And I said, that's very hard. I'm a merchant. I buy cell phones cheap. I sell it for more money. And I said, I'm not qualified to do the job. And he says, if I bring a normal telecommunications person to fix Sprint, they will never fix it. He says, I need a street fighter like you. I need somebody who can run a business with a different cost structure. And I told Masa, I can't do that because I have a very large company called Brightstar. Yeah. And then Masa basically offered to buy Brightstar, which back then was probably the most expensive, like we call them acqui-hires. He's buying a company because he could care less about my company. And that's how I became the CEO of Sprint. And I say this because most people will pass on an opportunity like that. My normal road is I was running the largest company in the world in my industry, but I was just so intrigued with how do you run these big legacy companies with over 100,000 employees. So that was my second big opportunity.
So let's talk a little bit about this. I mean, starting with Masa, I know him very well as well. So beforehand, you've been alone, you've been the entrepreneur. Here you join a team with a very iconic entrepreneur as well, who is probably not easy to work with. How did you handle working with him and not being your own boss anymore?
So we had a fascinating story. I told Masa, I cannot do this job because I don't know technology. And Masa says, we're going to do something very unique. He says, I'm going to work for you. I'm going to be your chief technology officer. So during the day, Masa was my chief technology officer. We used to design the network together, and Masa is a hands-on, and he loves to design a network. And he says, at night, I'm your boss, I'm your chairman. So we had this fascinating relationship. We're friends. We worked a lot together because what a lot of people don't recognize is if we didn't save Sprint, most likely SoftBank would have been bankrupt. That was the largest investment that he had. And then, comes the pressure, right? How do you bring an entrepreneur to go run?
Exactly. That's the next question. So, I mean, you've been surrounded by entrepreneurial people beforehand. There you come into a company that is making a loss, that is probably very bureaucratic. When an entrepreneur hits a ground like this, it's not always a soft landing. So how did you manage that?
So first I had to move. I used to live in a beautiful city called Miami. Yeah. And Sprint sits in Kansas City in the middle of the U.S. And I think it was a shock for the employees because they were traditional CEOs. And here you shop a 40-year-old from Bolivia who had no experience running telecom. And then everybody gives you advice. You have consultants. I mean, you're surrounded on day one. And everybody tells you, do not make changes the first 90 days. And it's hard. By day 7, I figured out that we needed to completely change Sprint. And the first thing that I learned is, it was a very easy exercise. If you're losing $4 or $5 billion and you have a cost structure of $30 billion, the fastest way to get to break even is to remove cost. Yeah. And it was very easy to remove costs because large companies tend to be highly inefficient. They have a lot of employees. At my former company, when I was an entrepreneur, I used to do an exercise called zero-based budgeting, which is basically you start every year with a blank piece of paper and you figure out what are the costs to run that company. I said, we're going to do the same thing. Now, Sprint was enormous, $30 billion of cost. And when I finished my first exercise, I told people we're going to reduce costs from 30 to 20 billion by completely redesigning the way we operated the business. Everybody thought we were crazy. 4 years later, we did the largest cost reduction, I think, probably ever done to a company of that size. We went from 30 to 21 billion, and then voila, suddenly we're profitable. Suddenly we generate positive cash flow. Suddenly our stock hits an all-time record. And then you also always have to be different, right? I mean, what Sprint had been trying to do for the last 20 years was to replicate what Verizon and AT&T were. But when you're half the size, you can never compete that way. So we invented a new product, which was something customers love, which is simplicity. It's what everybody does in the telco world today, which is unlimited, right? Instead of trying to charge consumers for gigabytes, megabytes, we invented the concept, pay us $50 and talk as much as you want, use the internet. We run models that would allow us to do that with our network. And today, the whole world basically operates on unlimited. We took cost out. We reduced the number of employees, and Sprint became a success story for the first time, profitable, generating cash flow. But it wasn't enough because we were still half the size. Did nothing change? We were profitable, but we were half the size of AT&T and Verizon. And then I called my friends at T-Mobile, and I said, I think we should merge. And everybody told me it's absolutely impossible. How are you going to go from 4 to 3 telcos in the largest market in the world? I remember when I convinced T-Mobile, they say, Marcelo, we'll do it, but we won't pay a breakup fee or anything. He says, it's all on your responsibility.
Yeah.
So I announced a merger, and every analyst says the odds of this merger being approved is 1%, 99% against it. Back then, we didn't have poly-market, we didn't have predictive markets, but if it would have been in predictive markets, it would have been a very low chance of success. I appointed a French one to run Sprint so I could focus. I appointed Michel Combs to be my CEO so I could go focus on the merger. I moved to Washington, D.C. I understood the American politics. I went through 3 congressional hearings. I went through a lawsuit against the Attorney General who tried to block the merger, and against all odds, our merger got approved. And fast forward today, we have created, again, another number one, the merger of the 2 companies. It is the world's most valuable telecommunications company. So that was a fascinating journey because I went from being an entrepreneur to actually being an operator of a gigantic company.
But again, the story around dreams does accompany you. The dream of you reducing the cost base and making it profitable, the dream of launching new products, the dream of a merger. How do you manage fear? Because, or do you have no fear? You come into an environment where you know it's difficult to succeed. On the cost-based reduction, fine, that's in your hands. But take the example of a merger where everybody tells you the merger will fail. How do you manage fear and you say, look, I'm going to make this work?
I think you always got to have a healthy paranoia. You always live in this world that things are not going to work out, that what you do is going to fall apart. We're not here to create average companies or middle of the pack, right? And Sprint was an average company. I was there to create a number one company, and I knew that since day one. And the only avenue to do that was the merger with T-Mobile. And I knew that there had been other industries where they had approved mergers, but you really needed to understand the players. I needed to understand what were the concerns. And I remember having a conversation with the Department of Justice, with President Trump, in which I explained that the only way that America, the U.S., could compete against China was if we had a good 5G network. The U.S. had benefited from the best 4G LTE network, and that's how companies like Facebook, Google got created because they all use a telecommunication network. And what I told President Trump was, if you don't, then Verizon and AT&T are very lazy companies, and they're never going to invest. If you trust us and you let us merge, I made a commitment. I said, we're not going to increase prices. We're not going to fire people. We're going to grow, and we're going to build the world's best network. And if you allow us to merge, then we start investing, you're going to force AT&T and Verizon to invest because they got to compete. Suddenly, you're going to have a 3-horse race, not what you have today, 2 lazy horses in the top and then 2 struggling horses. And he believed in us. We did it. And today is probably a great success story because the way we did the merger integration, the way the new T-Mobile performs, every time I see President Trump, he remembers, he says, it's incredible the memory that he has. I saw him in Saudi Arabia. He says, I remember approving the merger of your 2 struggling companies. Yes. He says, did you put a poster of me in your lobby or not? I did not respond to that. But in general, I think that was a great success story. Then after that, as you know, being a CEO of a public company takes a toll because it's a complicated job.
Tell me about it.
As you know, it's quarter by quarter, investors and all that. So then I quit. I told Massa, I'm done. I've delivered you.
Did he accept that, or was he not happy with it?
No, he was not happy with it. So, the returns were exceptional. When I took over Sprint, the value of his shares in Sprint were $7.5 billion. By the time it's all said and done and finished, that investment ended up yielding $97 billion. Wow. So 12x on a company that was almost bankrupt. But I told Massa, I'm done. I have to go back to being an entrepreneur. And then Massa very wisely says, Marcelo, you're a very good entrepreneur. You build the world's largest company. You're a very good operator. You saved Sprint. You did the merger. He said, but you don't know how to invest. So he says, I have a very good idea. I said, what? He says, I promote you to be the CEO of SoftBank International and to be the CEO of the group. And come to Tokyo, and I'm going to teach you how to invest. And then what I didn't know, what does it mean to be a chief operating officer? So then I called Tim Cook at Apple. I said, Tim, you work for Steve Jobs. Steve is very similar to Masa. You were a COO. I said, what does it mean to be a COO? Because you've probably been one of the best COOs in the world. And he said something very interesting. He says, Steve was capable of doing everything at Apple, every job. And he did a really good job. So my job is to do the things that Steve doesn't like to do, so he can focus on the things that he loves. And I applied the same thing with Masa. Masa at that point in time was moving his life from being an operator to being an investor. He always said, I have made the best investment in mankind. Invest 30 million into Alibaba that turned out to be 150 billion. And he says, and I only dedicate 1% of my life.
He told me the same.
1% of my life to investing and 99% to operating. He says, imagine if I dedicate 100% to investing.
Exactly.
So he says, why don't you come and you operate for me? Again, a story of you fly to Japan, you don't speak the language, tens of thousands of Japanese employees, highest paid employee in Japan. And I say that because, it's I call it the walk of shame. Like in Japan, you're supposed to feel shame because you're paid a little bit like France. And here we go, a new adventure. And we did some exceptional things with Masa. He was a fascinating part of my journey, being the number 2 in a company that has so many different assets. I had the chance to be part of when we bought ARM.
So what did you learn about investing during that time?
So investing is an interesting journey, right? Because when you're an operator, it's like you're a driver. You're in the car. You drive and you make the decisions. You listen to other people, left, right, faster, slower, and all that. Being an investor is like you sit in the back of the car and you're the one giving advice.
And there's obviously nobody else in the car.
But you're not driving the car.
Exactly.
And what I love about being an investor is that it allows me to apply everything I've learned, but do it in an exponential way. When you're an investor, you can apply what you know to many different companies, and you're not driving a specific company. What I love about investing is, the ability to make bets, right? To have a diversified portfolio. And I humbly say that I believe that operator investors are better investors, especially in today's age, than financial investors, because we understand the drivers of the business.
Exactly. You understand how to drive the car, but you're not driving it yourself. But sometimes it's also frustrating when you've been the driver to go on the backseat and be the investor. How did you manage, to step away from, always having the tendency to wanting to operate?
So that's the biggest challenge, because your instinct says, I can do it better, and let me jump in and all that. But you learn with time, you learn to trust. And you learn to teach, and you learn to learn, right? Because we had so many different types of investments, again, from internet companies to satellites, to, again, the most advanced humanoid company in the world, the most advanced, if you look at ARM, 100% market share of every single mobile phone. So I think that gave me the ability to look at a multitude of different businesses. But at the end, all businesses are the same. All businesses, they have different drivers. There are different things that can move the P&L of a business, and you start to develop a pattern recognition. The fascinating part of my job at SoftBank was, this is 2018, and we were already obsessed with AI. I don't even think people knew how to spell AI.
Well, it wasn't called AI, but...
Masa, we call it internally singularity, and that is the day that a machine is as capable or more capable than a human being. And this is why we did so many great investments, right? This is why we invested in TikTok. This is why we invested in Uber. This is why we invested in any company that could use data as a competitive advantage.
When you think about another dimension of your life, you grew up in Bolivia, you worked a lot in the US, you worked in Japan. These are very different cultures, as you say. How did you manage the cultural sensitivity and to make sure that you adapt yourself to these cultures and be successful in different cultures?
We learn, we're lifelong learners, and the culture difference is very real, right? And a lot of businesses fail because people don't take the time to understand culture. Americans are incredibly, I would say, transactional. The relationship is not something that comes natural.
Yeah.
An American will sit down, American wants to transact, and an American wants to go after that, right? the Japanese are completely different. The Germans, I work a lot with the Germans, right? Relationship do matter. We work in the Middle East, where the art of doing a deal doesn't come on day one. It's building a relationship and building trust. And I think I've always been a good bridge between cultures. I learned a few things. In Japan, punctuality is incredibly important. You know, I remember the first day I arrived late, 1 minute to a meeting with Masa, and he was furious. It was the only time Masa had been mad at me. And he says, in Japan, you arrive 2 minutes before a meeting.
The latest 2 minutes before a meeting.
And if you're late, you know, I remember once he shut down the door and he didn't let me into a board meeting because I had arrived 1 minute late. In France, in Latin America, you know, you arrive 5 minutes, 10 minutes. We call it's okay to be fashionably late. In Japan, it is a complete sign of disrespect. But then you understand the culture. How does a city with 30, 40 million people work so perfect? There's no traffic. The trains leave on the second it's supposed, and everything functions, right? You go to New York, it's a complete chaos, right? So you get to see the cultural differences, and that's a fascinating part of my life.
We spoke a lot about you as an entrepreneur and you as a leader. Obviously, you need to get things done while working in a team. When you look at, the role of your team in the different settings, so when you started your business at the time, ran Sprint, when you then ran SoftBank, what is the importance and the necessity of a team for you, and how did you design your teams at the time?
Yeah. So first is, I have a leadership trait, and I always tell people, always lead by example, right? I'm an incredibly hardworking person, and I demand the same from my team. If I didn't work so hard, it'd be crazy for me to ask my team to accompany. We make decisions with a lot of facts. We're very analytical. Earlier on, I realized that I had a lot of weaknesses, right? I realized, I never did my MBA. Everybody around me, they're all Harvard graduates, and I was never scared to hire people that are way better than me, right? If you look at all my teams.
Better in which way? Better educated?
In a specific area. Okay. So I've always had no problem in surrounding my team with people that are significantly better than me in whatever subject they do. And when you do that, you can reach an ability to basically do pretty incredible things when you have teams that are capable and are more capable than you. The salesperson was always better than me. The finance person knew finance better than me. The engineering teams were always better than me. And I think a lot of leaders are scared, to surround themselves with people that are significantly better than you. I learned that from Steve Jobs. What Steve did was always had the best person for every part of the job, right? And if you do that, you can spend time. Human talent is everything. I've seen great businesses, I wouldn't say be destroyed, but great businesses don't perform because they don't have the right leaders. And I've seen struggling businesses become better businesses because they have the right leaders. And I think my biggest frustration is not being able to find so many great people like all of us. But my biggest joy is, finding young talent that you can inspire, and in no time they actually surpass, your expectations.
Like your story on the flight to Bolivia. Exactly.
That's it.
You found a young talent, that was you.
Yeah. I try to always find, I think it'd be presumptuous to say try to find me, but I try to find young people that have that desire to want to win, that we can inspire for them to be, the next success story.
Going back to Sprint and T-Mobile, not only did you create the number 3 or one of the biggest and most valuable telco operators in the world, when you are looking at what you also did with the company, you went on to a massive revolution and transformation around making this company the leader in AI. Can you talk a little bit about that? How did you start this? Because today a lot of companies are trying it, but they get stuck. They do hundreds of pilots. They capitulate to the fact that the employees don't want to go on that journey. What did you do at T-Mobile and Sprint that made the difference?
So first, I do think that AI is going to be an incredible exponential opportunity for some, and it's going to be an existential crisis for others. And that's very important to understand. So we always live in fear. And I live in fear because I've been part of some incredible success stories. I've seen some incredible failures. When I was in the mobile phone distribution, there was one enormous company, a Finnish company called Nokia, right? And Nokia just missed one technology change, and then 3 years later, there was no Nokia. And that was the internet revolution. I remember talking to Oli-Pekka, who was the CEO of Nokia, and me telling him, all my customers are demanding smartphones. I said, back then was the Palm, the BlackBerry. And Oli-Pekka says, phones are made for people who want to talk. If you want a computer, you can go home and you can use your computer.
Didn't quite turn out like this.
I remember meeting Jim Balsil, the CEO of BlackBerry, when the iPhone came out. I said, nobody would want to type in a piece of glass. And he missed that whole revolution. And today there's no BlackBerry. So I live in that constant fear. I said, look, we're number one in the world. We're flying with T-Mobile. And probably one of the biggest things here, it was very easy to do Sprint because Sprint was survival. Either we took out 10 billion, we had 40 billion of debt, or there was going to be no Sprint. It was very easy to lay off 30,000 people when you explain to the employees, it is not that you're a bad employee, you're not going to be here because we're here to save a bigger cost. And if we let you go, know that you're saving 9 other lives. Yeah. So it's easier to do it. How do you transform a company that is flying? Number one telco in the world, outperforming everybody. Everybody's flying, and then suddenly we say, it is not good enough. The biggest opportunity in the history of mankind, in my opinion, is AI. AI is like electricity, right? It's a horizontal layer that's going to affect every business, every function, everything that we do. So I say, okay, T-Mobile, what is our role in the world of AI? And they all look at me, the management team, like I'm from Mars. But by then I had left SoftBank, and I was learning. I went and I took a course with Karim. It was called Competing in the Age of AI. Yeah. Nobody could believe it because everybody was consultant, BCG, this, and then they put CEO of SoftBank. So, and a lot of the companies that we studied in the class were companies that I was involved in. Alibaba. They talk about how you created Alipay or Ant Financial. Anyway, they talk about ByteDance, which is now a TikTok. I was deeply involved. They talk about Uber. I was in the board of Uber. So most of the use cases that he's using, they're all companies that I've been deeply engaged. So that I developed a good relationship with Karim. And by the end of the class, he says, hey, why don't you join the board and become the chair of the AI Institute? And I had the chance there. Some of my vice chairs are Mary Erdos from JP Morgan, Satya Nadella from Microsoft. And I truly understand the power of AI. And then I grabbed my management team and I said, look, we have to move and we have to become the leading AI telco in the world. So what did I do? There's one exercise that I love to do with all my companies, and that is moving them into the future. Fast forward 5 years and let's dream together of what is it that we're going to be. When I did that at Sprint and I made the management team dream of what we were going to be, people thought we were crazy. And we did the exact same thing at Harvard. I basically took the entire management team of T-Mobile. We went for 3 days to understand what is the art of the possible. And we did a fascinating exercise. I said, what would happen if Amazon got into the wireless business? Amazon doesn't have any stores. We have 11,000 stores. Amazon doesn't have anybody picking up the phones. We probably have 50, 60, 70,000 people throughout the different world picking up the phones. Amazon has 195 million prime customers. I said, Amazon cost basis would be half. I said, we need to think and act like Amazon is coming to the market. And then through the art of the possible, this incredible management team, it all goes back to leadership. They basically define a few use cases. And the reason why those AI transformations work, because it takes a leader to go top down and to choose 3 or 4 things that are going to move the needle, but more importantly, that you can measure. So we've completely reinvented T-Mobile. And if you listen to our analysts today, do have a management team who says, mainly through the AI and digital transformation, we will increase profit by $10 billion. You go from 29 to 39. It took us 125 years to get to 29. And that is the power of AI. Yeah. But to do this AI implementation, it starts with the leader at the top that chooses 3, 4, 5 big things that can actually move the needle.
So I think these are very important points. AI is a leadership challenge, not a tech challenge. And what you also say is you need to understand your processes in order to make them better. And, turning rubbish, just let AI run and change the rubbish will not make it better.
AI is not a technology problem.
It
is a human problem of learning how to implement AI. And I would say the biggest bottleneck of AI today, it is the implementation of AI. If you think about it, never in the history of the world we've had any technology where there's between $600 to $700 billion every single year that's invested to create a technology. I call that the AI factory, right? Power, semiconductors, data centers, and large language models. For me as an entrepreneur, to have the ability to access that technology on a variable cost basis without paying CapEx and be able to put it into businesses, I don't think there's anything more exciting in the world than buying businesses that are good businesses and absolutely make them great by applying AI to those businesses.
Which is now your next journey.
Which is my next journey.
Exactly. Look, it's a fascinating conversation. We at some point, unfortunately, have to come to the end. I have two questions for you still.
Yes.
One is, in your amazing journey, what is the biggest regret that you've got?
So I still don't know what would have happened. I always question myself, if I would not have sold Brightstar to Masa, what could Brightstar have become? Mm-hmm. And that's one. And secondly, and this is where I admire the French, is the amount of time I did not spend with my two youngest kids because I was so obsessed with building Brightstar that I missed their birthdays, their graduations, because work was 100%, and I was so obsessed with being number one in the world. Now in this new journey, I don't have two kids, I have 6 kids, and I make sure that my personal life plays an important part. I will still work very hard and all that, but I'm able to integrate my personal life into the business life. And I think what I always tell people say, but Marcelo, why do you work so hard and how do you manage your family? And to me, it's when you love what you do and you integrate your family. Next week, I'm going to Japan. I'm taking all my kids. And while I work during the day, my kids are enjoying Japan. So I would say, not spending enough time with my kids. And I have no idea, could Brightstar have been expanded and be one of the world's leading companies in many different industries if I would not have sold it? Because then Brightstar, went on to just be another regular company in the SoftBank portfolio.
That's why you went back to Brightstar as a name, to give it a second life.
Correct. My third venture, which is private equity, I basically recouped my name, Brightstar. I had to ask Masa if I can get back my name, which he, for a fee, agreed to let me use it. And we all returned to where we started. And it was very important for me to use my name, Brightstar. And I do believe that, again, in a world that we're living, the world of AI, there's a new opportunity to create new leaders. And I think private equity can be massively redefined. And I think this is a brand new opportunity.
My last question to you. What piece of advice would you give to a young listener that is aspiring to become a CEO or become like a very successful entrepreneur?
So I would say be careful what you wish for. The CEO, as you know, is the loneliest job in the world. You take all the responsibilities. The agony of defeat is way bigger than the joy of winning. And it's a very special job because there's a lot of pain that goes with that job. Because there's only one CEO and there's hundreds of thousands of employees. And it's been made for, I would say, people who have a high tolerance for pain. So be careful what you wish. This job is not for everybody, and it's going to take a lot of work, a lot of agony that otherwise, maybe if you're an employee, you will never have to suffer through that. It's a very lonely job.
Very good. Thank you, Marcelo, for a great and insightful conversation.
Thanks, Thomas. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.